Welcome to Clinical Lab Chat, part of the MedCore Podcast Network. I'm Chris Wolski, Director of Business Intelligence for CLP, and today I'm joined by CLP's Assistant Director of Business Intelligence, Andy Lundeen. Andy and I recently attended COLA's first Laboratory Enrichment Forum, and we wanted to share some of our experiences and those big aha moments that we had during the show.
Thank you.
Andy, welcome. It's your first experience on the podcast, and I expect it'll be the first of many. So I hope. I think we were just talking about because of the time change, it's taken us a few days to kind of recover from the trip. I think we're doing okay. So what's your this is the first laboratory forum for COLA. We've been to a lot of different kinds of trade shows. I've been to medical ones. We've been to other industries as well. So what were some of your general impressions?
I was great. I mean, it was obviously I'm still kind of getting a good feel for the industry, but I think this was just a good crash course just to kind of put myself into everything. And I feel like I already, was educating myself quite a bit, leading up to everything prior to the conference. But I think it was just, great information, tons to digest, I just love that it was like various like levels of proficiency. So, there was a lot for me to gather, and I'm sure for professionals too. I mean, it's right. I think, almost no matter where you're coming from, toward the, this clinical lab professions, I think you would definitely glean something. And I certainly did. Yeah. I think you did as well, probably. Right.
Yeah, for sure. And I like the size of it. It was a nice size. We're going to be going to a couple of shows in the next couple of months. The AACC, kind of the capstone one for us. And that's going to be a huge, huge show. This is a really nice, small, more intimate show. And I like your point about the different levels because they did have a like clinical laboratory director kind of track. And they also have much more of a general sort of intro track. And I think that's really kind of a problem. I know for me at least in the past, I've gone to many conferences where either it's way over your head and you could look around and you see that there's some people maybe new to the industry or just kind of starting their career. They're a little lost, and then vice versa. You have the stuff that's I'm neither one of us are laboratorians. Full disclosure to our audience, we're not laboratorians. I did grow up in a medical household, and I have some quite a bit of experience covering the medical topics, but we're not experts, laboratorians. But the more basic level topics, I think we're both accessible for newbies and non-professionals like ourselves. And also, I think for some experienced people as well. I think there was a lot, as you said, to get out of that. So, I know I've been thinking a lot about the show and some of the talks we went through and some of the presentations. What were some of the specific ideas that speakers that brought up that you've been thinking about since we've been back in the office and our day-to-day CLP lives?
I think some of the things that just kind of stood out to me, obviously some of the more I know there was a good keynote, but some of the just the industry professionals speaking in the panels. There was the one with hope I'm saying his name right, Reynolds Salerno on his Salerno, his overview on biosafety in the clinical lab profession. I think, there was just, super insightful. I think, obviously what with COVID kind of skyrocketing and everything, you think about biosafety in the lab profession and how significant that is, of course, has been for the last few years. But I think one of the more interesting things to me during that was just the fact that the advancements in biosafety over the last years have this sort of desire, right, I guess, to incorporate more, protections in biosafety in the clinical lab. And I know he mentioned kind of sort of a big impetus. Go ahead.
Yeah, making them a priority.
He was,
and making them a priority as well.
He was, he mentioned, and there was a big turning point in spring 2016, and was just doing a little more just research, and there's the CLIA committee. They got together and said, hey, biosafety of clinical labs, this is an urgent need. So they got the CDC to convene and create a task force. And this was all just sort of around the Ebola outbreak. And I think that was probably a huge driving factor for it. And this sort of led to, the CDC ultimately creating a steering committee to define and outline multiple biosafety projects in response to the recommendation from CLIA. And it just seemed to kind of, open the floodgates. And obviously that was huge over the last few years, biosafety.
Yeah, and I think one of the really interesting points he brought up in light of all of that work they started doing, particularly in 2016, and how in some of the recent documents that biosafety has been pretty much one of the top priorities, if not the top priority, which is really, I think, a really good news. And I think one of the things that he talked about, and I was thinking about it, I was really struck by this because it was one of those, right, you're exactly right. There were no major outbreaks in the labs during COVID. Now, laboratorians probably went home. They got ill from other family members or their own activities that they may have done in normal activities, but there were no outbreaks because of poor biosafety protocols in the labs, at least that we know of. And this is someone coming from the CDC, so I think they would I think he would have been aware of it if there had been some widespread outbreaks. So I think that really was for me. I think that was a really one of those aha moments, like, oh, right, exactly. So obviously, the labs were really on it, and should be applauded, not only for all the great diagnostic work they did and a lot of laboratory developed tests that were created, but also in the fact that they really were exemplars in terms of being safe and not spreading COVID to the within the laboratory settings themselves. I think another thing we talked a lot about this. I think during the show, and there were a number of presentations about this. Another thing I liked about the COLA show is that several of the presentations were done a couple of times. So if you missed it the first time, you could catch it a second time, and we actually did that on the staffing shortages presentation that was done. And I think that really, if I had to say there was one recurring theme at the show, it was staffing shortages. And I'm hoping to have an entire show devoted to this with the speaker during that. So if he's listening, I be ready. I will be reaching out to you soon. But what would you think about that in terms of the staffing shortages? In terms of there's a couple of points I thought was pretty interesting. There was a panel discussion we also both went to. I thought was pretty interesting, and talking about how money will get someone in the door, but it's really the work culture that'll keep them. And I think that really, I think that's a really. I don't think that's unique to laboratories or the healthcare system, but I think it's something certainly healthcare leaders and laboratory leaders should be really focusing on with that. And you attended a workload presentation, and I think you had a couple of aha moments.
Yeah. I mean, the one I was referring to was the I believe it was the establishing workload for cytotechnologists. This was sort of it wasn't directly related to staffing shortages, but the fact that it did tie to kind of staffing made it interesting to me. And I think I think for me, one of my biggest takeaways for MOLA was just kind of learning the history. I think there's a lot of cool like history lessons about just industry struggles and like overcoming certain hurdles. And that was one of them that was mentioned during the establishing workload for cytotechnologists, presentation. It just went into, exactly.
Cytotechnologists,
just the impetus for I mean, basically the Congress passed this CLIA 88 Act sort of as like a comprehensive quality standard, creating quality standards for all laboratory testing to ensure accuracy, reliability, and timeliness for patient test results. Because I think there was a 1987 Wall Street Journal article, I think it won the Pulitzer Prize, that detailed how these these lab there was workload issues with the labs, and this essentially resulted in there were deaths. I think specifically this was stemming from slides from Pap smears, and they were ineffective, and they did not detect sort of these illnesses that would have normally been detected if there were the right protocols for lab testing. And sort of the impetus for that kind of it ultimately they set up stricter rules with the CLIA 88 Act, and it just kind of led the way to what we have now. And I think that's a lot of what I find interesting is just the sort of the evolution of all of that, and kind of managing, keeping everything in line, having a good structure for clinical labs moving forward. And I mean, there was a ton of other stuff about, like you were talking about, the work shortages too was a huge thing. It was just interesting to me about the recruitment and attention session I attended, just because I think there's so many. It's so interesting to me. There's so many nuances in in the clinical lab space as far as hiring goes that I kind of I think you and I can kind of relate to, as far as like their a huge thing was like compensation, like how much are they making, and how's the work culture, and even like just putting up job applications online, like how important that is, how the application for that clinical lab position is. Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating that that touches all industries, and it's no exception here for clinical labs.
Right. Well, and it's interesting. There's been just on LinkedIn right now, on the feeds that I get, there's been this big discussion just about job listings, which they talked about quite a bit in that panel, and in the retention panel, and about how some of these listings are just crazy. They just, all things to all people, as opposed to really looking at kind of the thing, knowledge you have and the things that we need to train you on, and that really, I think that's really interesting. I think that's a really something to keep in mind. That what are skills? Technologist does. If a technologist knows how to do a particular test, and you just need to train them on how to use the Thermo Fisher machine or whatever it is that you have, that's probably a pretty short training slope, as opposed to they have to know every machine out there, and if they don't, well, you've now lost a good candidate. So that was pretty interesting. And then also talking a little bit about attracting younger people to go into it, and I think that's one area I think that was a little. I'm hoping that we'll talk about maybe in a few weeks with the staffing shortages podcast. I'm hoping that we'll be able to put together, but and talking about how to attract people, because it's one thing to recruit them and retain them, but how do you get them to get there to begin with? And I know one of the issues was there are not enough training programs, but I think it's even more fundamental than that as well. I think we can you and I could probably talk for an hour on this one point, but I think one of the things you mentioned to me was that some of that legislation that you're talking about with the workload with CLIA it was bipartisan. And I think one of the things that was really interesting was, I think probably the highlight, I think for both of us, and I think everybody at the show, was the keynote with Jerome Adams, who's the 20th Surgeon General of the United States during the President Trump's administration. And I don't know about you going in. I was a little nervous, quite honestly. I didn't know.
Yeah.
what kind of if this was going to be some sort of a weird political thing or what. And just from the get-go, he really I thought was really interesting how it was. He took that out. He took politics out of it and really stuck. He did two things I thought was really interesting. He really looked at it, looked at everything in a very scientific way, in a real scientific way, not just kind of I'm doing the science kind of thing. And also, there was a lot of humanity. There was a lot of humanism that, in the best sense, that I think he brought to his comments, etc. And I was really impressed. I think one of the things, a couple of points they made that I thought was, I'm just looking at my notes here briefly, that I thought was really interesting was the that we are a sick reimbursement system. You know, that our system is very reactive, and I think particularly for clinical labs, and we saw that there was also another presentation about molecular diagnostics, which a lot of that is proactive. You know, you're almost getting someone from the time they're born. So talking a little bit about how our health system is so reactive and how it needs to be more proactive, and being more proactive will help to solve a lot of societal ills that we're having, many of which are tied to poor health. We talked a lot about COVID, and one of comorbidities, obesity. Certainly, because of that, we have a lot of diabetes, etc., which cause a lot of issues with COVID, and probably ongoing into the future. So I thought that was really a really interesting point. And then his other point about health equity. It's not equality, it's equity. So getting people what they need, as opposed to we're all even, as opposed to and a lot of that's access. And there was the Lancet article that came out a few months ago about access. And so it's great if you have access to treatment, but what about diagnostics? It was that really kind of tied those two issues together for me. That idea of equity as opposed to equality. So I think that was a really interesting discussion he had. So what for you? What were some of the aha moments?
Well, you kind of touched on it a little bit. Just I guess literally what you're saying about the equity and equality, because he was saying, I think, I don't want to get into, I don't think we could talk about vaccines on a whole other podcast, but the fact that the major contributor, I think he was saying to, COVID deaths was obesity as opposed to, not being vaccinated. And I'm not saying, anything about vaccinations, but I just found that interesting in terms of it's it's thinking about equity and equality. It's just they're more susceptible to these illnesses, and this is part of a bigger problem that's kind of even outside all of this, where it's just we need to take care of our system better. And I think there was a little bit I think they touched on that a little bit, that the medical system's not perfect, and I think it's just kind of a lot of people are obviously realizing that more than ever now, and that's sort of the big takeaway is just just kind of, now that we're reaching an endemic phase. I mean, I guess you could say that with an asterisk, but I
think so.
I mean, and I just, he was a great speaker,
Yeah. I think that, and he talked through Operation Warp Speed, etc. And one of the other points, and just to wrap this up, I think one of the things that one of the points that I made that he made was talking about don't try to come from a moral. You're trying to impose some sort of a moral judgment on someone and then say it's science. And I think that was really interesting. He actually talked briefly, and again, this is a little beyond the scope of CLP, but he talked a little bit about while we were in Charlotte, the Roe v. Wade leak came out around that time, and he actually talked a little bit about that and talked about it in a very. He brought up one of the unintended consequences if you just approach this purely from a moral, black and white sort of approach, as opposed to a very scientific, nuanced sort of way. And I think that was something I also, I think, he didn't quite say it like this, but I think that when you look at the science, it makes it more nuanced. I think it was really interesting how he's been horrifically, brutally attacked, both left and right, for some of the things he's said, fairly or unfairly. But he's always tries to reach out to particularly those who are, I think, who have some of the loudest voices and have that kind of reach that really could poison the well, and reaches out to them. And I think that he makes a personal connection with them, and I think in a good way. And I think he's also reached out to people who are open to reason too. I think that's really, to me, seemed to be what he was doing. I think another thing that really also hit home in terms of equity, that is access, is that his own, and he talked about this at some length, his wife has a recurrence of melanoma, and some of that may be a question of they missed a window in terms of getting a checkup for another diagnostic test, and did they miss the window, or did that recurrence happen at that 6 month window where they missed it? But I thought that was really interesting too, because they were affected in a very direct way, he and his family, by missing a diagnostic test. And we post. I've lost count of the number of articles that I posted and probably you posted about people missing key tests during the pandemic, and I think that's another issue that we that, again, we could talk for hours and hours about that. But I think, again, goes back with that equity access question, and way back to that really fascinating Lancet study that was done a few months ago. So as we're wrapping up, I always find it really interesting when you go and there's always these big, profound moments. Was there anything that was just surprising or interesting that you learned during the forum? And it could be something sublime, or it could be something a little not so sublime. I guess.
I think one of my one of the more interesting things are just something I saw just by just kind of looking around at the attendees, is just like the diversity, just how many people from different backgrounds and cultures were there, and I just kind of appreciated that, because kind of going back to actually what he was saying, going back to the Surgeon General Adams, he was saying, that as much as contentious as it was as having him be on that medical team, the health team during the Trump administration, how polarizing that was probably for him. Just the fact that he was there to kind of represent some diversity in that group of people, where he was just showing, if I wasn't there, it would just be all these white people essentially. And just kind of, and he had that good anecdote where he said that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and that was just and that yeah.
I think that resonated with a lot of people. Yeah,
and that was just it was just good to just kind of see that diversity.
Yeah, for me, I'm going to go a little less profound. For me, it was Tariq Adwan, who gave that discussion about the molecular diagnostics. He was running through just some interesting stats, and I found out that we are 99.9% similar genetically to a banana. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then that was a little silly, but I thought was what was also interesting, because this study just came out, that our health is only determined, 30% of our health is only determined by genetics. 60% is by environment. So the way we live, and whether our environment is clean or conducive to living, and then 10% to
Right.
our healthcare. So that goes back to
Right.
our equity discussion, and certainly. I think I think the biggest takeaway is just how important diagnostic testing is, and particularly for those, for you and people like us who are just witnesses to what diagnostic testing benefits are, and getting the word out to both the larger, helping the profession do its best and keep doing its best, but also in our personal lives, spreading the word, and how important it is to our lives, and how critical, in particular in these last couple of years, how critical diagnostic testing was, and really how critical it is, has been for a long, long time. And it's not just we're sending it to the lab and some magical thing happens. They're really dedicated, and people who are doing
Right.
this really important work. So kudos to all of them. Kudos to COLA for a great first show, and we'll be there next year. And I hope some listeners who weren't able to make it this year will be able to attend next year. And we're certainly we'll be doing more of these industry trends and some of the shows we go to throughout the year. And so Andy, be prepared to be on future shows. We're looking forward to that. And I just can't believe it, but we've reached the end of our time. I think we covered quite a bit, but and given everybody a good food for thought. So we're going to have to do this again very, very soon. We have another couple more conferences coming up in June. So I think will be another opportunity to get together. So thanks, Andy, for taking the time away from your daily editorial work to join me. I also want to thank all of you for listening. So look for more episodes of Clinical Lab Chat in the future, and visit us online at clpmag.com and on all of the major social media platforms. So until next time.